I direct the Science and Technology Innovation Program here. I want to welcome all of you to this, I forgot what it is, maybe seventh in the series we've been doing on synthetic biology. For the past 2 days we ran a workshop here that brought together synthetic biologists with people doing sustainability science and science, technology, and society studies. So these were kind of three disciplines that were interacting, I think, in pretty interesting ways for the past 2 days. And we were able to convince a few of the people that were in that meeting basically to stay on and share some ideas with you. I think the one interesting thing about synthetic biology right now, because it's kind of a new emerging science, is that the boundaries are fairly porous. So you have people from different disciplines moving into it, chemists and engineers and physicists mixing with biologists and systems biologists and ecologists. But it also, I think, opens portals for other disciplines to walk in and out. And we've got some, I think, interesting examples of what's been going on. So I'll just go down the panel. Jane Calvert's here. She works in science, technology, and society studies, and she's going to talk a little bit about her interactions with the synthetic biology community or the life sciences community in general, and a project that she started on Synbio aesthetics. We have Mark Boudreau is here. Mark is a philosopher, and Mark has been interacting with the synthetic biology community and actually doing work on artificial life for what?
20 years.
20 years now. I guess science is catching up with philosophy here. And Mark is going to talk a little bit about his experiences kind of interacting with the synthetic biology community. And also, I think he's spending a lot of time in Denmark, so hope he'll talk a little bit about the differences between the communities and the interactions in the U.S. And we have Lino Paula here from the European Commission, who funds things like this, or close to this. He works in the governance and ethics area of the Director General for Research. So we have two practitioners and somebody who's actually at a higher level funding or looking at these kinds of projects to fund, and sort of looking at the issues around ethics of emerging technologies and science areas. So we're going to start with Jane. I think we've got 3 slideshows to go through. So people will talk for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for discussion at the end.
Thanks very much for the invitation. It's really great to be here. So I'm going to talk about the new forms of collaboration that I'm involved in as a social scientist working with synthetic biologists. And I'm also going to talk a bit about a new project I have which aims to bring artists and designers together with synthetic biologists. And then I'm going to look a little bit at these 3 quite apparently disparate groups of synthetic biologists, social scientists and artists and designers, and see what we have in common and where our areas of overlap are. So something that's really distinctive and interesting about synthetic biology is its early stage attention to the social and ethical concerns raised by the field. And this is demonstrated by the number of reports we've seen already on the social and ethical issues raised by synthetic biology. Here are just a few of the many reports that have been produced. And this has meant that social scientists have actually become involved in synthetic biology right at the beginning, which is a really interesting position to be in. In terms of precedents for this involvement, obviously the Human Genome Project was marked by the 3 to 5% of the budget which was dedicated to ethical, legal and social issues, or ELSI as they are known. And we've seen ELSI programs in many other areas of scientific research since then. In the European context, one of the reasons for the early stage involvement of social scientists in this field has been because of the controversies surrounding genetically modified crops in Europe, and some of the policymakers in synthetic biology in Europe say that they don't want another GM, so therefore that's why they're involving social scientists in the field. This is obviously something that's not unique to synthetic biology. We're seeing this widespread trend where social scientists are becoming involved in new areas such as nanotechnology, obviously being here, stem cell research and neuroscience. So what we're seeing is a real growing concern for the social dimensions of innovation. And it's not just social scientists, of course, who are involved in these new areas. There's an increasingly distributed network which is influencing the governance of science, and this includes policymakers, of course, lawyers, bioethicists, and members of the public. So turning specifically to synthetic biology, I'm just going to look at some of the collaborative arrangements that already exist. One of the most notable is the SYNBio program, which started in 2006, as most of you probably know, and which has 4 thrusts, one of which is called human practices and is social scientists working on synthetic biology. And this has a group of anthropologists led by Paul Rabinow at Berkeley and political scientists led by Ken Oy at MIT. And they have done some really interesting work looking at these new interactions and collaborative arrangements that we are seeing in the field. In terms of the European context, I'm not going to say anything much at all because I'm going to leave it over to Dr. Paola. There's been a project called SynBio, which has been very influential in Europe. In the UK, where I'm from, 4 of our research councils that fund scientific research have invested in 7 different interdisciplinary interinstitutional synthetic biology networks. But what's interesting about them is that they all require a social science component or an LC component. So this has led to the involvement of many new social scientists in the field of synthetic biology in the UK in these new networks. The one I'm part of is called the Synthetic Biology Standards Network, which brings together Edinburgh with other universities. Another recent development in the UK is a centre for synthetic biology called the Centre for Synthetic Biology and Innovation at Imperial College in London. And this has a very close collaboration with social scientists based at the BIOS Centre at the London School of Economics. So there are all these institutional arrangements which are bringing social scientists into synthetic biology at an early stage. And this, I think, is a very productive and interesting opportunity because I think synthetic biology is a really interesting topic for a social scientist, but particularly for my area of social science, which is the area of science and technology studies, or STS. And to kind of briefly explain this area, this is interested in the consequences that science and technology have on society, but it's not just about that. It's also interested in how the broader political, economic, historical and institutional context influences science itself. So it's about this two-way interaction between science and society. And the thing about STS is that it challenges some of our commonly held assumptions about science and technology. And for me, this is kind of epitomised by the phrase, things could be otherwise. The scientific and technological developments that we see are not inevitable. They're not necessarily have to be this way. They could perhaps be done in other ways because they are actually the result of contingent choices and funding decisions made in particular contexts, as well as more subtle influences such as particular theoretical or disciplinary frameworks which influence the direction of research. So I think synthetic biology is a really rich and interesting topic for science and technology studies. And this is partially because creating a new field isn't just about getting scientific and technological expertise. It's also about bringing together social, political and economic resources. And just to give you an example of the kind of combination of social and technical we see in synthetic biology, this is the front page of the iGEM competition, which is the International Genetically Engineered Machines competition, which takes place every year at MIT and brings together undergraduates from across the world to work in synthetic biology. But what we see here is not just undergraduates who are interested in using the science of synthetic biology, but also an attempt to build a community which shares certain values about safety, about security and about open access to the technology. So we basically see these kind of social aspirations being built into the standardised biological paths that the students use. So there are these great opportunities to be involved in synthetic biology as a social scientist, and there's really rich and interesting material there, I think, as well. So what role then should social scientists play in this field? And there are many kind of assumptions about what our roles should be, and there are many different roles we could play. One of them that comes up quite often is that we should wait for the scientists and engineers to do their work, and then we should kind of deal with the downstream social and ethical consequences of this work. But this is a role that I would rather not be in because it assumes that there's technical issues and the social issues are clearly separated. And as the whole of science and technology studies tries to argue, they're actually very interconnected. So I think there are other ways in which we can be involved in more kind of genuinely collaborative arrangements with synthetic biologists. And these could be kind of summarised under what someone from University of Sussex, Andy Sterling, calls opening up. And this involves exploring the assumptions that lie behind the choices that are made in synthetic biology and perhaps attempting to articulate visions of the future which might be implicit but are kind of underlying the technology, and perhaps think about alternatives to those visions. And this may involve stepping back quite a lot and asking really big questions about what are the aims of scientific research overall and what research should be funded. So it's very far from just studying the implications of technology on a society. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about art and design in synthetic biology, but this is actually very closely related because I think art and design can similarly open up synthetic biology in the same way that social scientific involvement can. And this is a project that's recently started that I'm involved in, and it's called Synthetic Aesthetics, as you can see, and it brings together myself and Pablo Schifter, who's another social scientist, with Alistair Elphick and Drew Endy, who are engineers, and Daisy Ginsberg, who's a designer. And what we are trying to do is get 6 scientists, engineers and 6 artists and designers and basically bring them together for 4 weeks and see what new forms of collaboration result and what kind of shared territory they have between each other. So why did we think this was an interesting idea? Partially this is because design is really central to synthetic biology, and one of the principles of some forms of synthetic biology is called decoupling, and that's about the separation of the design of something from its fabrication, in much the same way that an architect might design a building and a builder might build it. Those two things can then become separate activities, so design can become a kind of autonomous pursuit in synthetic biology. And so in this sense, biology becomes a result of design choices rather than evolutionary pressures. And synthetic biologists say that these design choices can include industrial and political imperatives such as safety, but maybe even aesthetic considerations could enter in. But the interesting thing about design is it instantly opens up a whole other realm of questions about what you design. Is it well designed or not? For what purpose is it designed? Who is it designed for? So these kinds of questions instantly bring in values and politics to the design process. And this opens up synthetic biology, again, to a broader discussion. And this is what some artists and designers aspire to do in synthetic biology. And a particular field of design that wants to do this is called critical design. And the aim here is to explore possible futures through the production of imaginary objects. So not to depict utopias or dystopias, but to actually kind of try and provoke debate by making abstract concepts tangible and discussable. And this is just an example of the work of Daisy Ginsberg, who's a critical designer. And what she's done is thought about, well, what would happen if we had this creation of a whole new range of synthetic organisms? How would they fit into the existing tree of life? Would we need a whole new domain to slot them in? And so by putting forward this image, I think you can see it instantly raises really interesting questions for discussion about synthetic biology and about how it might challenge our existing categorizations of living things. And what's interesting about this image is that it has become widely used in the synthetic biology community, even though it's a kind of hypothesis about a possible future. It's not depicting a reality. And it was actually on the front cover of the most recent edition of Nucleic Acids Research, because it's such a kind of interesting image. And another example of artists and designers being involved in synthetic biology, again, is with this iGEM competition. And Daisy Ginsberg and her colleague, who's another speculative designer, James King, worked alongside the Cambridge iGEM team, who actually ended up winning the grand prize at iGEM, and they produced a parallel design project, which unfortunately, because of limited time, I haven't got space to describe here, but I'll just say that it was called the Scatalogue and leave that to your imaginations. And it was inside this case that they carried around the iGEM competition. But it was very thoughtful, very provocative, very memorable way of engaging with synthetic biology. Another example of artists and designers working in synthetic biology is another iGEM team from Bangalore, who are all artists and designers. And what they wanted to do is recreate the smell of the soil after the rain, the kind of distinctive smell you get after it's rained and the smell the grass and the soil smells like, and use synthetic biology to do this. And they didn't want to do this because it was technologically challenging. They wanted to do it because of the emotions that that smell can invoke, the kind of memories, and also because of the place that the rain has in Indian culture. So we have, by bringing artists and designers into synthetic biology, we have them doing things kind of in very different and interesting ways that maybe other people wouldn't think of doing, and maybe challenging some of our assumptions about what synthetic biology should be for or could be for. So I briefly covered these 3 different areas, and I'm just going to look at the kind of interactions between them. As I said before, design and synthetic biology have a lot in common. Biology has arguably become a new material for design. Synthetic biologists often describe themselves as being designers, and both artists and designers and synthetic biologists want to produce new things. They're makers. They want to make stuff, something that I don't really. In terms of the interactions between science and technology studies and design, I think in respect to synthetic biology, we're both interested in forging new kinds of collaborations with synthetic biology. We're interested in a critical interrogation of the science and about these implicit assumptions and perhaps alternatives to those assumptions about the futures of the field. And in terms of science and technology studies and synthetic biology, we have a lot in common because we are both, at the moment, primarily embedded in university contexts. We're both interested in gathering data, in generating knowledge, in disseminating research through teaching and through publication. So what happens when you bring these 3 together? Hopefully we'll get a really interesting area of intersection where new questions can be asked that maybe wouldn't have been asked before. And hopefully this will generate new ways of thinking and promote critical reflection on all sides. But I don't want to be overly idealistic about this. Obviously, bringing people together from different disciplines is in itself very problematic. There's often entrenched power relations. There's often institutional barriers. There may be asymmetric expectations about what different groups can contribute. Also, collaborating can even highlight the differences between different groups. For example, we might have different ideas about what counts as good knowledge or what counts as appropriate methods. And I think these barriers are things that we're going to have to bear in mind in our collaborative work. But finally, to just kind of ask what we hope these collaborations will achieve. And someone asked us what we hoped our synthetic aesthetics project would achieve. And one of the engineers said that he hoped it would make synthetic biology better. And I'm hoping also that these collaborations could perhaps make social science and art and design better as well. But obviously the key question here is, well, what does better mean? Does it mean more sustainable, more environmental, more beautiful, more aesthetically pleasing? Does it mean more useful, more functional? Or does it mean more democratic or more reflexive? I think these questions we don't yet have the answers to, but it's something that we need to explore continually in our ongoing collaborative work. Thanks.
We'll go through all 3 of the presentations, so if you've got any specific comments, just note them, and we'll come back, and you can direct them to any of the speakers.
Okay. And this is what advances? Okay. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here with you today to talk about some of these issues involving synthetic biology. I want to say what I want to do in the little bit of time I have here is to say a little bit about my own background, because it's an illustration of how different kinds of people can get involved and have gotten involved in synthetic biology. And you can get some idea of the kinds of things that can come out of having a diverse group of people involved in participating in this activity. Second thing, and the main thing, is I want to actually spend a little bit of time talking about 1 or 2 issues of substance that have to do with the complexity of the policy implications of synthetic biology. This is stuff that's come out of me in particular being involved in this, so you can get a concrete example of what happens. And then the last thing is I want to give you a little bit of a flavor for what we're trying to do in Denmark that comes out of these sort of activities too. So first, just a little bit about me. As Dave mentioned, I'm a philosopher. I have a PhD in philosophy and a position in the philosophy department at Reed College. And I work in the philosophy of biology. And about 20 years ago, though, I got involved in this field called artificial life because I realized that trying to understand what makes life work, how emergence works, it was very useful to get involved in computer simulations and then ultimately get involved in work in the wet lab. And so there's a kind of natural intellectual trajectory which started with thinking about philosophical questions in the philosophy of biology and ended up getting involved in part in empirical work in the wet lab, which is a certain kind of synthetic biology. I also just want to mention that as part of my work in that, we ended up creating a small startup company, a biotech startup company called Protolife, which I'll say a tiny bit about. and also led to me creating and trying to get started this new initiative in Denmark called the Initiative for Science, Society, and Policy, which I'll come back to at the very end. So I say this partly to give you, as I said, to give you an example of my particular unique idiosyncratic background so you can understand why I've come to some of the conclusions I have, but also so that you can perhaps discount some of the things I'm going to say. And so sort of in the interest of full disclosure, I'm also saying these things. So first, a little bit of reminder about synthetic biology. Maybe a number of you have seen this website. This is the Registry of Standard Biological Parts. It's part of the idea behind the IGEM competition that Jane was just talking about. And it's part of the one of the key ideas that you hear about when you learn about synthetic biology, especially in the United States. The idea is that you can build components that are like the components of electronic devices, and then mix and match them, plug and play, and create a new kind of engineering of biology based on trying to do the same sort of thing that has worked in other fields of engineering. So this is an example, just superficially looking at it, you can get some sense of this, and if you read more closely at some of the text, you see things like them saying that using biobricks, which is what these interchangeable parts are sometimes called, using biobricks, standard biological parts, a synthetic biologist or biological engineer can already, to some extent, program living organisms in the same way a computer scientist can program a computer. So that's the vision. And so just to be explicit about a couple of the points about this vision that I want to call attention to, the idea, as I said, is to try to make biology like traditional engineering. And this involves having standardized parts. There's a lot of effort on making standardized parts, setting standards, being able to have these parts swap in and swap out, so there's a kind of plug-and-play nature to them. And the point of all this is that the resulting systems have predictable behavior. You can leverage all the great power of traditional engineering in a biological context if you can do this. And I think this quote from Drew Endy kind of illustrates the motivation, I think very, very nicely and succinctly behind trying to do this. What he said on one occasion was this: engineers hate complexity. I hate emergent properties. I like simplicity. I don't want the plane I take tomorrow to have some emergent properties while it's flying. So it makes perfect sense. And if we could engineer biology in the same way, that would be great. And, of course, to some extent, you can. But I want to tell you that, to an important extent, you can't. At least that's what I believe, and I think that's what actually a lot of people who actually do this will admit to you if you talk with them offline. They won't necessarily write this in the papers they publish, but they'll if you talk with them and probe what's going on, you'll see this. Why is this? It's because even the simplest possible living system that exists, like a simple bacterium, is incredibly complicated. You could argue that it's more complicated than the most complicated thing that humans have made yet. And it's complicated in part because there are lots of components that interact in nonlinear ways and synergistic ways. And as a result of this, emergent properties abound. Life is one of the best examples of a source of emergent properties. And, for me as a philosopher, I'm very interested in emergent properties. But anyway, ask a biologist, they'll agree too. So what this means, I think, is that in addition to the extent that we can, trying to make biology like traditional engineering, it's also critical for us to try to make engineering fit the reality of biology, which is full of these emergent properties. Living beings are simply not like clocks or integrated circuits. And this was one of the kinds of things that one of the problems we were trying to address in this company, Protolife, that I mentioned earlier. Why are people interested in being able to engineer biological systems? It's because life is incredibly powerful. Life has all kinds of wonderful properties, and if we could harness those properties, it would be terrific. There'd be all kinds of good things that we could do. But it's because of that very power that life is also risky. I mean, it has a life of its own. It'll do what it thinks is best, and it'll evolve in unpredictable ways. And so I think we need to acknowledge that, we have to confront that, and we have to learn how to cope with it if we're going to try to do synthetic biology, especially if we try to make things that are more and more complex. You know, this idea of biobricks works particularly well for extremely simple systems like the ones that people have started to make, but as we make more and more complicated things, you start confronting this complexity barrier more and more dramatically. And I think this is important because it helps you to understand some of the larger issues that larger concerns that people have about synthetic biology. So I want to say a little bit about this next. You may have, probably all of you have heard, if you've thought about synthetic biology or been involved in the discussion about it, that lots of people, some people worry about it because they say it's playing God. And Hamilton Smith had this famous quote. He said, when he asked about this by a reporter, he said, "We don't play." When he's asked, saying, "Aren't you playing God?" he says, "We don't play." And in many people's eyes, they just thought that he was just pouring gasoline on this fire. And I have to say that when I talk with a lot of people about this, and when I remember my own initial reaction to this, I tended to dismiss this worry. I didn't think it was a serious concern for a variety of reasons. And I think a lot of people have a similar kind of reaction to the one that I had initially, which was that, first of all, when you talk about playing God, there are lots of different religions, and different religions have different perspectives on this kind of thing. So there's not a single voice that comes out of any sort of the religious community about what we should or shouldn't do with regard to synthetic biology. And then, of course, even within a particular religion, people will disagree. Different theologians disagree. So first of all, there's a whole lot of disagreement. Second, we're living in a Western democracy. We're supposed to separate church and state, right? So even if the church did speak with one voice, it's not clear that that has any immediate implication for what we should do, in our civil society. Next point is that I think you can argue that we should play God. I mean, if you mean intervening in the world, including life and death issues, trying to make things better. I mean, that's what modern medicine is all about. I would argue. So I think playing God isn't bad from that point of view. It's actually our responsibility. And then the last point, another reason why I think a lot of people just dismiss this is they say, look, I'm an atheist anyway. I don't believe in God, so, you're just, it's going in one ear and out the other. So that was, I think, the initial reaction of a lot of people. It was my own initial reaction. But after thinking about this a bit more, I've now come to adopt a different perspective that comes directly out of this point I was making before about the complexity of life. So let me try to explain this to you. I think that actually there's another, in a way, as deep source for worries about playing God. And it has to do specifically with the unpredictability and powerful consequences of manipulating forms of life because of these emergent properties. I mean, powerful and unpredictable because they're emergent. So think about it this way. Consider this hypothetical, this little thought experiment. Imagine your neighbor in his garage was making some new device that was very powerful and had unpredictable consequences. He was doing it because he thought there'd be some good thing that would come out of this. But still, it was a very powerful new thing he was making, and it was also had unpredictable consequences. What would your reaction be? I think, among other things, what you probably think is, well, I'm worried about this unless or except to the extent to which the following things hold. Or let me put it this way. What would make you start to feel better, start to make you feel more safe and secure in this kind of context, knowing what your neighbor's going to do? Well, one thing that would help a lot is if your neighbor actually understood the consequences of what he was actually going to make. He really could see what's going to happen. If I do this, this is going to unfold. If I do that, this is going to unfold, and that's going to cause this and the other. I mean, that would start to make me feel a little bit better. Another thing that's critical, though, is this person would need to be able to properly evaluate and sort of morally and ethically weigh the various consequences of what he's doing. I mean, for example, if it ended up being very powerful and some people, like he and his investors, would make a lot of money, but it would end up creating a lot of problems for other people or increasing the income disparity in the Western world or various other kinds of things, and he thought that was fine. In other words, if you didn't trust his ability to weigh the moral and ethical implications of what he was doing, then you would also be worried. Or if you thought that he actually could, start to weigh these different the value implications of what he was doing appropriately, then you start to feel a little bit better, I think. And then the last thing is that to the extent to which he had the ability to sort of fix problems that arose and be able to change course and go in a new direction if need be, you'd also start to feel better about this. Okay, so this is what at least I come up with when I go through this thought experiment. Now just look at these three properties. These three properties are kind of an approximation of the qualities that are often attributed to a deity. I'm not talking about actually being omniscient, but to the extent to which you can actually understand what's going to happen, you start to feel better. To the extent to which you can actually properly weigh the values that are involved, you start to feel better. To the extent to which you actually could try to fix the problems that arise, you start to feel better. So I think, in fact, one of the reasons people raise this worry is that it doesn't actually come from religion. It actually comes with a concern about, making things, changing our world in ways that have unpredictable and powerful consequences. I'm not saying we shouldn't do this. I'm saying that we will feel comfortable about doing this only if you do it without hubris, only if you do it with the proper kind of humility and the proper kinds of constraints. And these constraints are sort of roughly triangulated by a certain kind of picture of what a deity is, I think. So, and you can say this is something that I think even atheists need to take seriously. So that was the first point. And then the second point, in a way, the last point I want to make here, is that there's a group of people who would say, and I think this is true about a lot of people in the synthetic biology community, they'll say, look, we know there are risks, obviously. In fact, the synthetic biology community has been really great about trying to take a lead in discussing the implications and the risks involved in the research. But then they also, I think, will say, look, we have fields of risk analysis, for example, that can help us to just settle these questions. So that's the last point I want to address. Say a little bit about risk analysis. Many of you probably know a lot about risk analysis, probably much more than I do. But the sense that I get is that what it essentially involves is kind of weighing the possible outcomes of different courses of action, trying to assess where there are uncertainties, and also trying to assign some kind of value to the possible outcomes. Essentially what you're trying to do is perform something like an expected value calculation from decision theory. And then you pick the course of action which seems overall to lead to the best outcomes when you properly do this sort of calculations. So it involves constructing, in principle, at least something a little bit like a decision tree. And the problem is that when you're dealing with life, with these emergent properties that I've talked about and these unpredictable consequences, it's impossible to make this kind of a decision tree. We are deciding in the dark. You don't know what the consequences are going to be of different courses of action, especially very far down the line. I think that comes with the fact that you're dealing with life, I think. And so I think what we need to do is I don't think we should assume that existing ways of doing risk analysis are going to easily provide the right kind of analysis. I think we have to rethink how to do risk analysis in a context in which we're deciding in the dark. So to end, how should we cope with this kind of complexity? First of all, my personal belief is, sort of echoing one of the things that Jane was saying, I think that scientists need to be engaged in these larger issues early on. I think the sort of traditional picture of the scientists make it and then it's someone else's job to figure out whether it's a good thing or how we should use it, that doesn't seem to, as someone who's involved in this work on the ground, it doesn't seem to make sense to us. Especially, you need to have scientists involved in trying to figure out how can you engineer systems with emergent properties. And you can do it, it's possible, but you have to focus on it. And you have to work on it. And I say that's one of the things that my little company is developing ways to do. So I know it's possible to do it, and there are a variety of other strategies to pursue. And it also involves rethinking what risk analysis is in a context where we're deciding in the dark. So for me, the key thing is that, as a practitioner in this field, the key thing is that scientists need to have a stronger sense of their social responsibility. We're all familiar with the concept of corporate social responsibility, and regardless of what you think about that, what I'm arguing is that there should be a similar concept of scientific social responsibility that should be given the same kind of weight. This has implications about what the education of our next generation of scientists should be, and it also has implications about how stakeholders should be involved, how scientists should communicate with stakeholders, work with them, work with policymakers, inform the general public. And that's the kind of thing that we're trying to explore new ways of doing in Denmark at this Initiative for Science, Society, and Policy. The key idea behind this is to have, you can think of this initiative as sort of it's like an NGO for scientists. You know, concerned scientists who are involved in this work want to help people understand what they're doing and think through the consequences of it and potentially affect and change what they're doing as a result of this activity. So it's critical to work with stakeholders and also to let the general public know what's going on and to hear what the general public has to say. This is happening in Denmark, and it's not an accident that it's happening in Denmark. It's partly because, well, actually a key reason it's happening in Denmark is that there's a tradition in Denmark of citizen involvement in government. Much more so than in the United States, and, for example, drastically more so than in Italy, where I've also spent a lot of time. So I think it's this is one experiment of how to try to move forward, and you know, we're just in the very early days. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start, I first wanted to thank David and Eleanor for the kind invitation today to present a bit of the European Commission's activities in this field of synthetic biology. But before I start, I would like to make a small disclaimer that what I will present today are to be considered as my views rather than an official position of the European Commission, because besides informing you a bit about our initiatives, I will also, for the discussion, give some reflections and some challenges as I see them for policymakers. So that's more a personal touch to the presentation. Let me see how this works. Yeah. So what I will speak to you about is in more general terms, what kind of policy instruments we have to address emerging technologies, and kind of our take on these technologies, how we and the research DG of the Commission approach governance and ethics in light of these new technologies, and concretely what kind of activities we have pertaining to synthetic biologies, and some challenges as we and also me personally see these technologies. So my presentation will be a bit more verbal than the others. I mean, policymakers like words and paper, but I will speak about the importance of images as well. First, some characteristics of converging technologies. They all have in common that they operate on the convergence of traditional disciplines. So they are multidisciplinary, which makes them very complex, both in terms of their scientific impact and their societal impacts. And you can see that in many different areas. For synthetic biology, obviously, it is still very unclear where the technology will head through. But for example, the ICT revolution, you can see in everyday life now very much integrated into it, whereas 20 years ago nobody would have even thought of the internet, iPhones, etc. So hard to predict. Also, converging technologies are very rapidly evolving nowadays. So they're moving targets, which makes them hard to confine it to a certain area, but also to define in terms of, say, legal terms. Obviously, if you want to legislate or regulate for a technology, you would like to have a clear-cut definition of what the technology actually is, so you can appropriately regulate also the users and producers of a technology. But as you probably well know, the definition of synthetic biology is being discussed very much by scientists involved. So how can these rapid and complex developments be adequately and timely regulated? Well, basically three main instruments are available: binding law, just the standard legislation, international conventions, or in the European sphere you talk about directives, but also national regulations. In addition, you can also look more into soft law approaches. So codes of conduct, guidelines that are not legally binding, but nevertheless are very concrete and set a certain set of practices. And in Europe, what we often work with is this so-called open method of coordination, which is kind of a best practice benchmarking between countries, so countries can learn from each other in Europe. A third one, and that is what I will focus on most in my talk, is what you can call engagement approaches. The idea of, in an early stage of a development of a technology, try to involve different potential and actual stakeholders in having a dialogue about what these new technologies can have as an impact for society. And in a very early stage, try to get scientists and civil society stakeholders together. Now, an important point I would like to make is that soft law and engagement are not just binding law without teeth. I mean, you can set different objectives for soft law and engagement approach. You can have obviously a wider range of issues discussed because you are less troubled by these issues of definitions, for example, but also you can set different types of ambitions. You can have more, say, idealistic ambitions that you may not fulfill in the end, but you can agree upon a certain ideal that you would like to accomplish as a society. So these types of instruments can be more inspirational and also aspirational. Now, speaking a bit about the European context, we have seen in Europe that in the case of genetic modification, especially GMO foods, that the purely regulatory approach does cause problems, and it didn't work in Europe to just, with experts, with just biosafety regulation, get this new technology introduced in a positive way in the European markets. So, also taking that experience in Europe, there's kind of a conviction that for such a complex technology, a more broad approach is warranted, and ideally starting with these engagement approaches, and then, if necessary, take more action, soft law, or even binding law if necessary, where needed. Now, speaking more concretely about our approach, DG Research, the general philosophy behind, say, the governance approach of our DG is to support and stimulate this upstream two-way dialogue between scientists and stakeholders, what Jane also already referred to, so as to internalize societal aspects, ethical aspects in the design of new products and practices. So, rather than having end-of-pipe solutions, really from the start, try to have in a design a properly adjusted frame, so that later down the line, when these projects hit the market, there will be more chance of have them accepted by consumers. So this philosophy materializes itself in support for these engagement and soft law approaches, which deal with a wider range of issues than purely biosafety risk assessment only. This is just an overview of our research program. I will skip that, but the important thing to note is that I work for a specific program called Science and Society, where we take these matters to heart, which is a relatively small program within the overall 7th framework program, the FP7 program as we call it, which is the overall funding program for DG Research. But within this program of Science and Society, we look at all these types of issues, not only governance and ethics, but we take a very holistic view. We also look into aspects of science education, how to stimulate young people to choose scientific careers, other types of communication activities, the role of women in research. So it's a very holistic approach to science, and with the conviction that science is part of society. So more concretely, how do we do that in practice? How do we support these different approaches? Well, in terms of soft law, and this is not specifically focusing on synthetic biology only, but in general terms, we have ethical review. Every project that we fund at the Commission funds is subject to an ethical review, where we evaluate the ethical aspects of projects that are being submitted to us for funding. We carry also out more, say, thematic reviews of ethical aspects of new technologies via the European Group of Ethics, and that is not within DG Research, but my colleagues from another DG called the Bureau for European Policy Advisors. So this is an advisory body to the President of the Commission that also make recommendations on how technology should develop, and they also provide guidance to easy funded research. Now, a concrete example of what we did in the recent years was made a recommendation for a code of conduct for responsible nanotechnology. So that's a different area, but it's of course a related area, where we also take kind of a broad view on how responsible nanotechnology would look like. So taking account of general principles like sustainability, precaution, inclusiveness, and responsibility. I'll skip this one for time-wise. Moving on to the communicative approach, we fund a lot of different activities, activities that kind of thematically look into certain fields of research and look into the ethical, legal, and social aspects of these technologies. That is one type of activity that you may well know. Other activities that we do is support capacity building for review bodies, for infrastructures, networking between different policymakers or stakeholders, exchange of best practice, all kinds of activities. And a new activity, a new instrument, I should say, that we have is a mobilization and mutual learning action plans. I'll give you an example of that a bit later. Let me first start you with some examples, and I'll go through them quickly as well. We fund, as I said, specific projects on the ethical, legal, and social aspects of research. One project that has been going on for a bit over a year now is a project called Synthetics that looks really into the more environmental applications like biofuels of synthetic biology. And what that project tries to do is get the synthetic biology community exposed to concerns that could be raised by civil society. So it's really a collaboration between social scientists, ethicists, philosophers, and the synthetic biology community in Europe to try to discuss the potential implications of social implications of this technology at an early phase. And in the end, this project will also deliver recommendations back to us. Now, second project that we have is called Sybil. This is a project of more, say, the health applications of synthetic biology, and they also look into, say, further potential developments like human enhancement and those kind of issues. Again, the idea is to have an early deliberation, an early exchange of ideas of these developments, and report that back also to policymakers. Now, these projects are European-wide consortia, so they have kind of national discussions, and then also on a European level bring that back to us. Support actions that focus more on capacity building. I already mentioned the European Group on Ethics, but we also have what is called the Forum of National Ethics Council. This is a networking activity where, say, the national ethics councils of Europe come together and exchange information and discuss developments. And for example, just in March of this year, we discussed synthetic biology in Spain under the Spanish presidency of the European Commission. And you see there, it's a bit vague and fuzzy, but that's the report of the European Group on Ethics that was published in November last year on synthetic biology. So that is already a first start of how also on the policy level this technology is being discussed. Now we do additional things more generally, also on the global level, for example with UNESCO. I won't go into that, but just that you see that we are trying to discuss these type of issues already also on a policy level. Now, what I mentioned, we have a new instrument called Mobilization and Mutual Learning Action Plans, and that is really kind of the most ambitious way in which we try to have this engagement approach. What we do there is not only, say, have experts being brought together, but really trying to have the scientists, the social scientists, ethicists, say the disciplinary experts, bringing those circles together with civil society and stakeholders, and even with citizens. So the idea is there to really have a holistic consortium, more or less a reflection of society, discussing these new developments. And these consortia are not so much based around a certain technology, but more based around a societal problem. For example, in the context of synthetic biology, you can think of energy security. So there what we try to do is more with a problem-oriented approach, see how technologies can be part of a solution to solve a societal approach, but without choosing beforehand whether, for example, synthetic biology or another technology, or even, say, more social innovation, should be key to solving this societal problem. So it doesn't put the technology central, but it takes a problem approach and sees how a certain technology can be involved in it. And the idea is to have a long-term collaboration around a grand challenge, big societal problem, where different representatives from civil society take part in a long-term collaboration. Now, to continue, I would like to present some challenges I see them, and also as they come forward in the scientific literature, with regard to these new approaches. Because of course it's an ambitious agenda, but can we realize it? Well, concretely, in terms of synthetic biology in Europe, and I guess also here in the US, several people and stakeholders raised the possibility of a code of conduct for synthetic biology, the need for a code of conduct on synthetic biology. There is already one developed by industry, but that's more really in the context of biosafety and biosecurity. And the question is raised whether this is adequate. Should we may have a more encompassing, a more holistic code of conduct? But then the question, of course, becomes: what should such a code specifically address? Is there really a need for specific synthetic biology governance and ethics and a code as such? In addition, you can ask the question whether such a code of conduct that mainly addresses professionals is still relevant or at least effective for this field, where you have this development of a do-it-yourself garage synthetic biology that in theory could encompass a lot more people being practitioners of this technology. I mean, there's this idea that maybe in the future these Lego bricks, as they are with biobricks, these Lego elements that are now already being used by high school students in these competitions like the iGEM you probably have heard about, that will take off in such a successful way that maybe in the future, much like now you can give your child for its birthday a chemistry kit, you could give them a synthetic biology kit to play with. So if you come to that situation, I mean, obviously just talking to the professionals wouldn't be enough anymore. So if that really becomes a reality, I mean, of course, whether it is the case, that it remains to be seen, but if synthetic biology really spreads out into civil society, then again, wider engagement actions become even more warranted. Just a picture of, there's an interesting website you may want to look at, doityourselfbio.org, which kind of identifies the different local networks and groups that are already working, say, in a community perspective on this. Now, in these engagement approaches, we often will talk about public engagement, citizen engagement, and dialogue with the public. Well, things we have learned, especially from the GMO debate in Europe, is that timing and framing in these debates is very important. That is something, of course, that we as policymakers have to look into very carefully. If you do it too early, then little people will be interested. We had, for example, in the Netherlands, the Dutch office for the Dutch Institute for Technology Assessment, the Raven Institute, initiated a debate already in 2008 with the aim of having this early warning, early identification of new developments. But they found that they could garner very little political and societal interest. So there is also a difficulty in starting it too early. Too late is, of course, the problem that then you have already a polarized debate, and also the technology will already have taken its course to a certain extent. So it's difficult to both have a dialogue, but also to influence the direction that the technology will take, and also therefore to have concrete policies about it. Another aspect of importance is talk about the technology? What kind of issues are you going to discuss? In which context are you going to discuss them? If these kind of parameters for a discussion are being set by government, then obviously that will evoke a reaction. And what we have seen, for example, in the GMO debate was that many of these societal debates that were initiated by ministries and governments were kind of confined in terms of that the people could discuss under which conditions a certain GMO food would hit the market, but not really question the technology itself. So again, this question of opening up versus closing down of choices is important. And then you see often that what governments takes as a focus doesn't correspond to the public concerns. So that's a difficulty with framing top-down. Bottom-up, you've got similar issues. There you see that for example, in the UK, they tried with a debate, GM Nation, to very much leave debates open to stakeholder and citizen framing. But there they saw that the debate was in a sense a bit hijacked by active NGO groups, and also it can become then so broad-ranging, talking about wider issues of social justice, that it becomes very hard to put it back into the context of policy decision-making. So framing is an important issue there as well. And in that framing, not only this general aspect, but also very specifically language and vocabulary between different expert groups is important. You see gaps between the scientists and civil society, but also between scientists and say social scientists and ethicists, and even, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, Mark. What you see often is that even the disciplinary experts that are supposed to represent society, I'm talking about ethicists as an example, that there you also see a difference between how, say, disciplinary experts have a tendency to argumentatively evaluate concerns, whereas citizens have sometimes a more intuitive way of evaluating developments. And there you see that, for example, and Mark already mentioned that this playing God argument is often disregarded by ethicists, whereas that is an important issue that is being raised by citizens continuously. So there you see also that it is important to be aware of these gaps in framing and in language and in ways and modes of evaluation of concerns. Now this picture was already shown by Jane, but here you see how, say, in a more imaginary way, an NGO, in this case the Canadian ETC group, portrays synthetic biology as indeed playing God, and that nevertheless resonates with the public. So timing and framing are important. At this point, with regard to synthetic biology, at least in Europe, society is still largely unaware about synthetic biology, and no real synthetic biology consumer products are on the market. So it's still an open, fuzzy concept in the public's mind, and therefore it is at this point also unclear what exactly should be discussed if you want to have a dialogue. That is still something to be further investigated. It's not well identified, but what I think is important is that nevertheless there is a framing going on, and that is both already being put forward by NGOs, but also by the scientists themselves when they talk about designing life, when they talk about even the term synthetic biology, that nevertheless has an impact on the public's mind, and that can become perceived as being insensitive to societal concern. It doesn't need to be, but nevertheless, I mean, the concept and the way in engineering terms scientists talk about life can become perceived as in a certain way insensitive, especially in light of the past debate we already have had on genetic modification. Now, as I said, at the moment it's still very fuzzy. This is an overview of what comes to mind when I say synthetic biology. This was a study that was done by the UK Royal Academy of Engineering in 2009. But these still open-mindedness can change rapidly when NGOs get active, but it can also of course, be the consequence of an unexpected event that happens. Now, I just want to show you this slide. It's also from the ECT group, because a scandal can cause a rapid change in public opinion, obviously, and can set really a mindset in the public. Now, I just want to show you this slide. It's a bit hard to see, but if you look carefully here, you may recognize this logo. This is the logo of BP. BP is one of the investors in synthetic biology. Now, I could easily see how an NGA that wants to stir debate can use this, obviously in a rather unjustified way, but can use the current scandal here in the US with the oil spill in talking about synthetic biology in the context of, again, we see this industry people who are putting this forward in the market, and they are saying that it's safe, but hey, look what had just happened on your East Coast. So these are wildcards that can be used, and I think that therefore that also calls for action of the synthetic biology community to be proactive in these things, to really already now start actively talking to the public about what they are doing, so they don't get into a situation that their science is being framed by others. Obviously, you cannot control that to the fullest, but I think, nevertheless, if the first thing that a citizen hears about synthetic biology is something like this, then you're in trouble. So it's at this point, we cannot, as policymakers, answer the when we should have the debate and what should be the content of such a debate and dialogue. We cannot answer that question yet that well. We need further research on public and stakeholder concerns. But nevertheless, it's important, I think, not to wait too long. And obviously, that is not only a responsibility of policymakers, but also of the synthetic biology community itself. Now, summarizing. Research, dialogue, and policy action about concerns beyond risk assessment in synthetic biology are warranted, and we cannot rely only on regulation. We will have to engage to a very substantial extent with society, and also in a holistic way. So these approaches that we are now supporting, we will continue to support, but obviously the European Commission is only one player in this field, and we are also hoping that on the national level, but also say more the synthetic biology community itself, will take these elements of concern on board and will join this endeavor to engage society. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, we've got some time for questions. Just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you so we can get it captured on the video. Yep, JD.
I'm J.D. Hansen with the International Center for Technology Assessment, and one of the things we look at is synthetic biology and its ethics. So I appreciate all of the discussion today. One thing I would like you to unpack a little bit more. Each of you alluded to how do you look at the alternatives as part of a risk assessment, and discussed how you frame it. A few weeks ago, a member of the U.S. White House was talking very glowingly about a synthetic biology product made by the company Amyris to make a precursor to an anti-malarial drug. And one of the things some of us have been saying about that, and I have yet to see it, is since there are already African farmers growing the precursor to artemisinin that this genetically engineered form is supposed to replace, why aren't we looking at how do we keep those African farmers in business instead of make a genetically engineered version that, in my mind, puts them out of business? So how do we look at those issues that, there aren't any African farmers in the UK or in Europe to even be part of stakeholders groups? So how do we look at these alternatives in a way that actually includes the real stakeholders?
Maybe I'll start. Our approach. So first of all, I don't. We're not sure what the best way to proceed is, and we're just trying to grope our way forward. But I think our strategy would be at ISSP in Denmark would be to, if we could, try to include the stakeholders, and if you can include them, include people who could speak for them, such as NGOs, for example, so we're not trying to. We don't specifically have a particular frame that we want to put on these issues. What our main concern is that the discussion, first of all, that people be aware of what's happening, so that they can, the general public too, so that you can make informed decisions and likewise, and be, in other words, so first of all, be aware, and secondly, have that awareness grounded in reality as we understand it as scientists. So there's a lot of sort of misconceptions about synthetic biology. For example, in addition to playing God, you sometimes hear about Frankenstein or Frankencell, and that's just so far removed from any biological reality that if the people who were interested in these issues realize what's actually happening, they would realize that that's just a non-starter. And so we're trying to sort of provide a certain level of scientific reality and grounding to the discussion. And then where it will go, we don't know. We'll just have to see what people want. And I think we have to have a conversation. That's our approach.
Yeah, if I could go next. Of course, you can't include every stakeholder, but if you can include a diversity of voices, you're going to get a broader range of views. So I suppose that's preferable. In terms of the specific example you pointed to, another way of including different perspectives is to look to history. And there's actually been a really interesting paper recently, I think it's in the Journal of Systems and Synthetic Biology, which looked at synthetic chemistry and how it tried to produce natural rubber and indigo, and what happened to people who were producing that in developing countries, and whether they were put out of work or not, and they were in one case and they weren't in the other. And so it kind of, there's all these contingencies, and it depends on the situation. In terms of the artemisinin, I think the quantity being produced by the farmers is much, much lower than the quantity that can be produced by synthetic biology. So that's one kind of discussion about using synthetic biology. But I think there are lots of interesting issues there. But I think you can bring in a historical lens as well, which will give you another perspective on these issues.
I think it's indeed a very pressing and difficult problem that you raised. But one thing beyond indeed including representation indirectly of these groups, could also be to think in terms of a certain compensation. You could think of setting aside part of the profits, which would end up with this new company that would produce this artemisinin, to help African farmers to change to a new crop or some other economic activity. There are some examples of that, also in the context of benefit sharing of genetic resources, for example. Obviously, that also has its weaknesses. So it's a difficult problem to address. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, Harry. Let me just get you a mic here.
I was interested, first of all, in the dichotomy of two approaches here. One of which is, let's have a dialogue, and maybe laws and regulations aren't such a the good track, and the other on which was looking at essentially the regulatory process and the question of well, you were using the word neighbor and your concerns. The neighbor of the neighbor has no mechanism to stop your neighbor from doing some horrible things, and people have done that already. And the other comment I have, which I'm concerned about in this, and particularly with Paula's very interesting and worthwhile commentary about the dangers of early intervention. That could be true, but it isn't, in my view, the problem. Because my feeling has been, based on at least 40 or 50 years of looking at some of these problems on an international basis, that what usually happens is we don't intervene, people do something very, very bad, and before people realize what's out there, and we might add, we've been watching this off the coast of the Gulf right now, before we intervene, something terrible happens, and then government has to come in a very immediate, large, and probably not very well thought out way in this process. I would suggest that both on a national and international basis, that early intervention, both for the dialogue and the framework of a governmental regulatory approach as emerging technologies take place, would be a very wiser approach, given even the dangers of too early, than waiting for a disaster to happen, as sometimes it inevitably will in some sector. And my only final comment, which I would love to have the comments of your panel, is would it not be better to think also, and not just establishing individual frameworks for Synbio or genetically modified food or nanotechnologies, but for governments and organizations like the EU to really think of setting up a larger, if you would, framework for emerging technologies that will be in the area of technology assessment, which David knows only too well, but frameworks that are governmental in nature, are regulatory, but also are collaborative and take into consideration the stakeholders of that, but put in place things that go across the board. Thank you.
Maybe I'll start with this again. We at the Initiative for Science, Society, and Policy agree with your assessment about the role of whether the relative trade-offs between the benefits and disadvantages of going too early versus too late. We're inclined to err on the side of being too early. That's why we're talking about various things that we know are extremely safe right now, but we also know that in 5 years or some point they could potentially be very risky. And so our whole mission is to let people be aware of what's happening and what tomorrow could bring, so that you have a chance to think about it before there is a crisis. I mean, exactly what we don't want to do is to keep it all secret and then, have us wake up and read the front page of the New York Times and discover that someone, created a new form of life in the laboratory, and that be the first time anyone's heard about it. That was more or less what happened with Dolly and cloning, and you saw the reaction. There was a bad, sort of backlash, and so we want to avoid that kind of whiplash. That's part of our mission. And then with regard to your last point about sort of a larger international framework for thinking about emerging technologies, I think that seems to me to be a good idea. One thing that I would say, though, is that in addition to anything like that, which is top-down, the governments internationally deciding how to do this, I think it's also important for there to be an important room for a bottom-up voice, including the voices of the scientists who are involved to really know what's going on. And that's what our particular focus in. We think the other would be good, and we want to make room for this bottom-up activity as well.
If we go in the same order as before, Yeah, I do think that definitely you will be able to talk about whether there is a general framework for emerging technologies which would be helpful. But I think it's important not to ignore the specificities of synthetic biology. And I think coming from my perspective, I think just taking a pre-existing ethical framework and imposing it on a new field might be missing some of the really interesting features of synthetic biology. For example, the student competition. This raises new issues which don't necessarily fit into any of our existing regulatory frameworks, and the attempts to develop different types of intellectual property regimes that we're seeing in this field. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize the specificities of synthetic biology. Also, I think in terms of being too early or too late, from the European perspective, we have the precautionary principle, which probably means we do things very differently, but I think I'll let you elaborate on these issues.
Thank you. Well, in terms of too early, too late, I think if you talk specifically about regulation, then I fully agree that you should try to be as early as possible. But the difficulty for regulation is, of course, that you have to have a clear picture of what you're going to regulate. So you have to have a kind of concrete forecast where the technology is heading. Otherwise, you end up with the difficulty of not really being able to define clearly what you regulate. In addition, I think it's a matter of gathering political attention, which usually is difficult if there's not yet a real pressing problem, as you know well. But also another consideration is if you don't get the regulation right, you're stuck with it for years to come. It's hard to come to regulation. It's even harder to change it. So I think that also gives rise to at least some caution to have regulation in a too early stage. With regard to your question about an overarching framework for emerging technologies, there is also indeed a discussion that we're having in Europe, and it was also a discussion in the context of synthetic biology after the Commission published this recommendation on nanotechnology. And of course, the question becomes, well, why don't you have it on nanotechnology, not on synthetic biology, not on ICT? I agree with Jane that, of course, there are differences between different emerging technology. Nanotechnology, you could say, is in a certain way more confined to a specific group of scientists and industries, because it's such a high-tech speciality that you cannot just in your garage do nanotechnology. The space would be okay, but the technical part would be the problem. So it does depend a bit, I think, on the technology to focus your framework on. But nevertheless, I fully agree. There should be a reflection on what kind of also the general disruptive potential of emerging technologies are, and whether you should have a more holistic approach to it. Like, indeed, we have this precautionary approach to new technologies, where that is in a certain way an overarching concept that transforms to all these technologies.
Other questions? Yep, we'll take one last one. Hold on a second.
Thank you. Paul Foreman, Smithsonian. Underscoring Jane Calvert's appeal to history, I wonder, and her remark that one should not simply postulate an ethics as applicable from one time to a next, and our times change rather rapidly, so that one doesn't need to go back to the 19th century and synthetic chemistry to see significant change in the context for these technical innovations. So the the mind that Asilomar was addressing is not the mind that the risks of nanotechnology are addressing. And one can see, for example, in the changing rhetoric regarding basic research, where today basic research today, and today means in just the last 5 years, today basic research is seeking to justify itself under the label high-risk research. Clearly, the neoliberal mentality has gained a predominance that simply did not exist at the time when the rhetoric which one hears from the panel regarding risk assessment was evolved.
Sorry, is there a question? Or
well, I'd be glad for any comments on the comment.
I prefer blue skies research to high risk research. If we're talking about basic research, I think it has this a nicer metaphor of a kind of big distance. But yeah, very interesting use of the word risk there. Also, transformative research is a very interesting policy category, which I think requires further analysis, as does frontier research in the European Union. But
yeah, of course, when we talk about high-risk research, we don't mean the risk that's talked about is not risk to society. It's just risk of perhaps the science not working out. You know, it's the risk of being successful in your scientific endeavor at all, right?
Indeed, but it's the point is the possibility of using such a vocabulary.
When I was asked, I put together the synthetic aesthetics project, we were encouraged to put together a project that was likely to fail, which maybe similar to try and push us to do something a little bit more exciting. But yeah, the kind of how that fits into understandings of risk in other contexts, I'm not sure.
I think that one of the points you're making is extremely important, which is, and I think well known to all of us, but it bears we should remind ourselves, and that's that the terms that we use to talk about these things matter a lot. And in fact, over the last 2 days at this workshop that Dave and Eleanor put together, there was some concern expressed at the very beginning that the term synthetic biology was a poor choice to describe what we are trying to do. I personally don't think it's a poor choice, but there were a lot of people in the room who did think it was a poor choice because it pushed the wrong buttons. So I think I think you're absolutely right that this is the terms that are used matter a lot. They matter in terms of their effect later on, but they also, as you're saying, they kind of reflect changing attitudes that we have over time.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Jane and Mark and Lino. The slides, I think, should be up on the website, so they'll be downloadable. The webcast will probably go up in the next few days, so people will be able to tune into it. So thank you very much.